Hi, welcome back to the Jyske Bank Auditorium. I hope you enjoyed your Arla break and that you are now ready for the second half of Aarhus Symposium 2017. To moderate this session, we have invited someone who is always well prepared and ready to ensure an exciting session. We had the great pleasure of working with him in 2015, and I'm more than happy to have him back here today. So, please join me in welcoming news anchor and journalist at TV2, Paul Erik Skammelsen.
There's one thing I don't do myself usually. There's always someone out back shouting at me, "Turn on your microphone!" And it happens every night, and it happened here today as well. Some things don't change. Now, we're going to hear from Lars Rohde, chairman of the Board of Governors at the National Bank of Denmark in a moment. And let me just remind you, if anyone in here needs to be reminded, I'll still do it, whether a board or a governor of a central bank, a national bank, is powerful. Just go back 5 years, 5.5 years. We were in the middle of the part of the financial crisis that we call the Euro crisis or the Eurozone crisis. There were pundits, commentators in newspapers competing about setting the shortest possible date for when the euro would die. I think someone at the Financial Times had it down to 2 weeks. And then you have Mario Draghi, the president of the European Central Bank, making a speech in London. And then he says a few words about what he'll do to save the euro. He says, whatever it takes, whatever it takes. Those 3 words, I'm sure we can debate this from here to eternity, whether they saved the euro, but they calmed the markets. And that's a picture of the powerful positions of the central bankers. Some will probably paint a nefarious picture of it. I won't here. This is about change today, and we're in a world with new players on the international scene, or maybe old new players. China coming up, we see new global companies, not always playing by the rules that old companies played by. Just ask Margrethe Vestager, who was here earlier. We have new technologies which basically seems to make borders, however much we control them, seem borders irrelevant. And then we have something really old-fashioned right now. We have old-fashioned political anger in the Western world. Referenda like Brexit, Donald Trump, voters going rogue, some people in the elite would probably say, at least having their own ideas. And basically we're back to, you could say, what created the Western mind, doubt and self-doubt, in this case about whether liberalization, globalization, the ideas that we've built these last quarter century on are right. And we're still also, somehow, at least politically, in the shadow of that great recession, the financial crisis. But economically, we're hearing it's going well. We hear that from Lars Rohde, we hear that from the government, we hear that from the OECD and others. So I'm wondering, what does a governor of a national bank do in a situation like this? I imagine that Lars is basically just looking out to see what will be the next crisis and see if he has whatever it takes to avoid it. The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so impressed of this symposium. It's so well organized, and you have been able to attract a lot of students, a lot of people from all over society. I think that is an achievement beyond expectations. So congratulations from me. Today I think I will try to present some of the challenges I see going forward in the financial sector. And I always have a bad habit of starting with my key messages, because then you can sleep without being disturbed. The key message here is, of course, that digitalization and globalization will increase innovation and competition in the financial sector going forward. And we should consider that a very positive development. But it will, of course, also create new threats to the financial system, such as cyber attacks. So the operational risks of yesterday are not the same as the operational risks of today and tomorrow. Another threat to our financial system is the risk of a new financial crisis. We should use our still quite good memory of the recent crisis and its impact on our economy to strengthen our financial regulation and prevent future crises. Central banks have played a crucial and also to some extent, as it was mentioned before, a high-profile role in the recovery of the economies of Europe and the US after the financial crisis. Hopefully, we enter more normal times in the sense that monetary policy will not remain, as it is said, the only game in town. And the last one, despite an increased focus on new technologies in financial services, such as digital currencies, Danmarks Nationalbank will not grow into a bank for every citizen in the country. Did you get it? Financial intermediaries perform an important task for society and help ensure a flexible and financial system in Denmark. So I will argue in more detail that you should not expect central bank digital money from us. The future of money and finance will be marked by innovation, as I mentioned, new technologies and increased competition across borders. We should embrace these innovations, and just like we embrace innovations in all other sectors in the economy. New technologies and innovations may lead to the disappearance of some of the financial intermediaries we know today, so be it, while new players enter the market for financial services. However, we can also expect to see new partnerships between old companies and newcomers in the financial sector, new players. One area of the financial sector that could undergo rapid changes soon is the payment market. There are multiple reasons for this, but I would like to mention the European Union's new Payment Service Directive. Have you heard about it? It's called a very sexy name, PSD2, which will be implemented in Danish legislation in next year. And due to this upcoming legislation, it will become easier for third parties to enter the payment market. The presence of new third parties will increase competition in the payments market, which existing players must be ready to match. Currently, there are quite a few new players who attempt to gain a foothold in the payments market by either competing with established companies or engaging in partnerships. Roughly speaking, these new players can be divided into two groups. The first group are the so-called Fintech Companies. These are companies that are highly specialized in financial technology and typically small and based on an entrepreneurial culture. The other group, and in my opinion, maybe even more interesting, new players is in the payments market are the multinational technology companies. They are already huge players in other sectors. So to speak, they have the customers. They already have the customers. Two examples are Apple and Alibaba, who have just launched their payments services, Apple Pay and Alipay in Denmark. Whether the agents in the payments markets are banks, specialized payment service providers, or multinational technology companies, authorities have a responsibility to safeguard against systemic stability problems, and that is extremely important. Regulating and monitoring of risk will remain as important in the future as today, and that is one of the important tasks of Danmarks Nationalbank. The Nordic countries are among the digital frontrunners, and digitalization has already affected the financial system significantly. At the beginning of 2017, less than 5% of the Danish money supply was made up by banknotes and coins. Furthermore, the use of cash is rapidly diminishing. To give you an example, I traveled to London in the beginning of this week, and when I arrived in Gatwick, I found out I forgot to take my English pound notes with me. But I fared quite well, no problem. So even in good old UK, you can get around without banknotes. In 2016, card payment accounted for around 80% of the total retail turnover in Denmark, leaving only 20% of the total retail turnover for cash transactions. So in Denmark, it is possible for Danes to choose a cash-free living if they wish to. I could be tempted to ask how many of you have cash in your pockets right now, but I won't do that. We haven't time for it. But the digitalization of money and payments enables citizens and businesses to make transactions faster at a lower cost for society. However, the digitalization of money also involves a new kind of vulnerability, as it relies on complex IT systems. I'm certain that we are past the point where cash is an effective backstop should electronic payment systems break down. We just have to admit that. And this makes, of course, cybersecurity an extremely important task. In general, digitalization is a double-edged sword. The digitalized world has produced a number of advantages for the financial sector and society as a whole, but the increasing dependence on computers has also created a new threat in the form of cyber attacks. And a variety of agents are involved in cyber criminal activity, from small offenders, basically sitting in the basement, 16-year-old, you know, that type, through hacktivists to nation states. The agents have different motives. Some attack purely for financial gain, others seek to disrupt or destabilize their target. However, they all have one thing in common. Their level of sophistication is ever increasing at a rapid rate. In 2010, it took approximately 5 years for small-time offenders to adopt the most advanced techniques developed by the intelligence agencies of nation states. Today, small-time offenders, the guys in the basement, seem to adopt the most sophisticated techniques in only 18 months. It's a little bit scary. Because the attacks are much more frequent than those of nation states, the overall impact of cyber incidents has increased. A recent example of cyber attack is the incident that paralyzed Maersk Line for several weeks. The malware inflicted serious damage on Ukraine and spread to many global companies, including Maersk. Imagine if a critical institution was hit by a cyber attack that paralyzed it for 2 weeks, while the financial markets were already volatile. What would be the implication for financial stability, and what would happen if the malware spread to other key financial institutions? Or to put it maybe in a little bit more dramatic way, imagine October 2008, where we were discussing the financial stability of the Danish and global banking system, and we, on top of that, suddenly were unable to use the ATMs. I think that would be a little bit a scary scenario. In a worst-case scenario, cyber attacks aimed at critical financial institutions will not only have economic consequences for those institutions directly affected, but also make people lose their trust in the financial system as a whole. And that is also a very scary moment. So cyber attacks are therefore not just a threat for individual institutions, but a threat that could shake up the whole foundation of the financial system, people's trust in the system. Because of this, we took an initiative in form of collaboration among the critical companies in the Danish financial sector, the so-called Financial Sector Forum for Operational Resilience, a very sexy name. There are primarily three goals. One is to create an overview of cyber attacks, threats to financial stability. The second is to implement joint measures to ensure financial sector resilience. And the third is to set up a framework for collaboration and knowledge sharing. I think we have to accept that cyber attacks are inevitable and that attackers are persistent, but we should not go into some kind of fatalism. It's some kind of arms race. So by continually improving and testing our cybersecurity capabilities, we can significantly mitigate the systemic risks of cyber threats. The creation of FSOR is an example of how key institutions in our society have to adapt for changing circumstances. These cyber attacks have been around for some decades now, but cybersecurity can no longer be left to a few specialists. It has to be on the agenda of senior management in all institutions, and furthermore, the growth of cyber attacks increases the need for cooperation between private and public institutions, because the weakest link in the chain might expose other institutions to security threats, as in the case of the cyber attack on Ukraine. One thing is a growing potential cyber threat. Another is the threat of the financial crisis of the more traditional, in the more traditional sense, where the confidence in the financial system disappears overnight and the whole system freezes. This threat became a reality 10 years ago, and as it evolved, it became the worst financial crisis since the late 1920s. Few of us have, for good reasons, personal memories of the 1930s and the huge and very devastating effects of the financial crisis on the real economy. But we all got a clear picture of the area of the Great Depression. During the recent crisis, we once again witnessed how banking crisis evolved and developed into a severe macroeconomic slowdown. Then Denmark was quite a hard hit. You could say that we ended up losing 7 years of output growth. Only in 2014, our level of economic activity was restored to its level prior to the crisis. With this in this fresh memory of the effects of the financial crisis in mind, we now work on bolstering our financial system to prevent such crises to occur again. The crisis revealed a need to shake up the regulations of credit institutions. And in recent years, we have seen a number of international regulatory initiatives which aim at strengthening the resilience of the financial sector and preventing a new financial crisis. Looking ahead, the question is whether we have truly learned our lesson well and what to do next. Let me present my vision for the future financial regulation. It is, in fact, quite simple, if I could get it. Well, someone had very interesting. Here we are. The pillars of financial regulation. Our future regulation framework should basically rest on 3 pillars: addressing capital, liquidity, and last but not least, resolution. The first pillar should ensure a solid, true, and fair capital adequacy position based on the actual risk exposure of the bank. Second, we need requirements to ensure healthy liquidity management and stable financing, as included in recent Basel reforms. You know, there's an old saying, you start being illiquid and then you are insolvent. So liquidity is basically quite important. Last but not least, we need a credible resolution regime for banks. In our European case, we need a strict implementation of the EU Directive on Banking Recovery and Resolution, BRRD. This includes setting minimum requirements for own funds and bail-inable liabilities to be used in the resolution of a bank in trouble. It also includes formulating credible, and I really mean credible, resolution plans for a credit institution. This is all about getting the incentives right. No credit institution should be too big to fail. I'm sure you have heard that way of saying it. But if you are too big to fail, you basically operate with a state guarantee behind you. And that creates very unsound incentives. If we, through the ongoing reforms with the new rules adopted in Basel and Brussels, end up delivering on all 3 pillars of regulation, I think we have learned our lesson well after the crisis. And with all these measures in place, we will be ready to take the next step. And that is, maybe to your surprise, simplifying the remaining part of the regulation and ease the red tape for banks, the administrative burden of banks. Why could that be done? Because then we can rely on shareholders and boards to take on their responsibility. And we can basically treat every single credit institution like any other company in the world. I mean, we have not special resolution regimes for shipyards for a reason. In a global capitalistic world, you should be able to go bankrupt in peace. And that is also what is coming to the banks if we get this regulatory system in place. So basically, these 3 pillars would leave it to the market forces to keep the financial sector in check. As long as banks perform on all 3 parameters, the credibility and soundness of the bank will ensure their access to the necessary capital and funding. And with the resolution regime in place, we no longer need governments to save banks with taxpayers' money. The most important effect, however, is that we significantly reduce the likelihood of a new financial crisis with all the detrimental effects of our economy. Next, if possible. Yes, let me now finally turn to some future perspectives for the central bank community. Since the beginning of the financial crisis, many things have been far from normal for central banks. In response to persistently weak demand and low inflation, central banks across the globe have reduced their monetary policy rates to historically low levels. In fact, Danmarks Nationalbank was a central bank pioneer in terms of setting the key monetary policy rates well below zero already 5 years ago in order to offset large capital inflows. As we have seen in Denmark, the low interest rates set by central banks across various currency regimes are simply the result of one thing and one thing only. Central banks are trying to fulfill their specific mandates which have been assigned to them by elected representatives. The low interest rates in Denmark have been nothing but a necessary consequence of our fixed exchange rate policy. To quote my good friend Mario Draghi once more, that non-elected officials should deliver on their mandates. And our mandate in the Danish Central Bank is to keep the peg. However, very low and even negative interest rates might not be preferred for an extended period. Long periods with very low interest rates create risks of financial bubbles in specific sectors of the economy. For example, we have seen increasing prices in the housing market here in Aarhus and in Copenhagen. And there we have to be vigilant. With interest rate close to their effective lower bound, yes, here we are, central banks have deployed a range of so-called unconventionally monetary policy measures to achieve the desired amount of monetary accommodation. The most famous one has been to engage in purchases of financial assets, including government bonds, on a massive scale, known as quantitative easing, or in short, among friends, QE. QE has become an integral part of the set of unconventional tools central banks use to support economic growth and increase inflation towards target levels. And you can see that there has been quite a lot of balance sheet expansion. The key question is, do these unconventional measures work as intended? Before answering, it is important to remember that in the heat of the crisis, many national governments were paralyzed for political reasons or by fiscal constraints. Therefore, central banks were forced to take on a large responsibility in fighting against the crisis in order to limit its adverse consequences. As such, QE programs helped the US economy to recover quickly from the financial crisis. In the euro area, the ECB's unconventional monetary policy and its, not least its communication to the markets have been crucial in order to support the euro area economy and help the euro overcome its most severe crisis since its introduction. Taking on a greater role in the economic policy making in this period has left central banks open to criticism. However, when looking back in 20 years' time, I think history will acknowledge the responsibility they have taken in the period of crisis management. Hopefully, central banks can allow themselves to relax a bit more in the future and let fiscal and structural policy do the heavy lifting. But one thing we know for sure is that central banking and the ideal money will change a lot in the future due to new innovations. So that will be my last issue here. The question is how? Looking at the recent developments in digital money and payments, this is perhaps the most relevant question for a central banker right now. In these days, the so-called cryptocurrencies, and especially bitcoins, are on everybody's lips, even though their use is still relatively limited. Just to put it in perspective, in fact, the number of mobile payments in Denmark exceeds the total global amount of payments conducted by bitcoins. So there's some way to go. However, before making trivial comparison, we must remember that cryptocurrencies like bitcoins have no fundamental value, and therefore their value can increase or decrease quite fast. This is what we see here in the picture. This is completely the opposite of how we usually think of money. One of the first things we learn about money, and I'm sure you have also learned it, is the function as a store of value. In other words, a fundamental characteristic of money is related to price stability. In contrast, Bitcoin have been compared with the tulip bubbles in the Netherlands in the 17th century. Looking at this figure, it's not difficult to see why cryptocurrencies cannot be mistaken for ordinary national currency, which are under the control of central banks. The most interesting thing about cryptocurrencies is the underlying blockchain technology. In the coming years, I believe you will see a lot of interesting examples of blockchain's huge potential. So we have to take the two issues separately. One is the Bitcoin and the other thing is the technology behind Bitcoin. So there's an ongoing debate about the fact that money creation is not controlled by central banks, but is taking place in commercial banks as they grant loans to households and firms. As you know, we are issuing banknotes and coins, but we do not regulate the creation of money in connection with bank deposits and lending. Therefore, it is sometimes suggested that Danmarks Nationalbank should take back control of money creation by creating a central bank account to every citizen in the country and provide a digital central bank currency. However, it's important to remember that even though today's money stock primarily consists of deposits in the bank accounts, it is not possible to create more money than households and firms want to hold. It's quite simple. In other words, the total amount of money in society, both banknotes and coins in circulation, as well as bank deposits, depends on demand. And by changing interest rates, and hence the cost of holding money, the money demand is, in the end of the day, determined by central banks' monetary policy. This is because monetary policy interest rates are transmitted to banks' deposits and lending rates, which in turn have a direct impact on the demand for deposits and loans, and thus economic activity. Therefore, money supplied by banks as deposits is not any way worse than money supplied by central banks. In a well-functioning financial sector, the amount of loans and deposits should be allowed to increase or decrease depending on the demand for liquidity. This means that firms can obtain the loans needed for investment purposes, and at the same time households can plan their consumption profile over time. In this way, banks help to secure flexible financial systems for our economy. Given the important role in society, the banks are subject to extensive regulation and supervision by authorities. As I mentioned before, it is important that we continuously ensure that there is no excessive risk-taking in the financial sector, and we do not repeat yesterday's mistakes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think you should move in here. You're the man in the middle, and I have two iPads. So
yeah, and
so Jyske Bank was almost
this is not
tripping.
the first time.
Now, there's a lot of questions about bitcoins and so on. I'll save that for a moment because I have a couple of things that I think we should get through. One is cybersecurity, and the other thing is politicians and their role and responsibility. But let's start out with cybersecurity, because you were sort of taking us back to that moment of October 2008, in the middle of financial crisis. Nobody basically, I guess, knew what the heck was going on and who held what, and everything was basically poisonous to touch. And saying, imagine if there'd been a cyber attack. Now, with the things that are put into place by you, the government, by other countries, because this is not going to be a national thing, I think, would a 16-year-old, or for that matter, a 60-year-old, or maybe someone aided by a government be able, in a situation like that today, to take down the financial markets?
Hopefully I can say no, but I think we have to admit that there are risks outside there we don't even know. I mean, as my good friend, the former defense minister of the US, Mr. Rumsfeld, he had this distinction between the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. And I think what we have, in fact, are confronted with here is the unknown unknowns. So we don't even know the shape of the threat. But what in our darkest moment, we, of course, are going through a chain of thoughts about what is going to happen if one way or the other the total financial system is locked up. And I have to, it's not only about the financial sector. Some of some also of the members of the so-called FSOR circle are also the suppliers of digital power. For example, in Denmark, all the big financial institutions are basically served by two IT providers. Do I have to tell you any more? And look at our basic utilities, those supporting and supplying electricity. What about them? I mean, today we have no financial system without electricity. So there's a lot of risks out there we have to confront and be able to approach and to secure that they are in fact behind bars, so to speak. But it's an ongoing arms race, and we should be prepared for that. And I'm very happy to see that government and parliament these years are putting a lot of effort into to this area, simply to try to make our institutions much more resilient vis-a-vis cyber attacks. But it is a threat, and we have to use a lot of time and money and effort to secure the systems.
Is that a threat primarily, you think, coming from private citizen, the young individual who catches up on whatever new there is in a year and a half, or is it a group of private citizens, or are we talking states here?
I think we should prepare ourselves for all these, both the individuals and the government-sponsored entities. And that is, of course, is quite scary.
Well, I guess I'll be reporting on it if it happens.
No, you can't.
Oh, no. Good gracious. That's worse. All right, let's just get into the bitcoins and cryptocurrencies, because there's a lot of different questions about it. And I think it sounds like the younger people here are not as dismissive of Bitcoin as you sounded, at least. There's a question of, do you think the growing value of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general will be a threat to how monetary policy is done today and in the future?
The simple answer is no.
Why not?
Because it's not money. It's glass pearls. So if you would like to invest in Bitcoin, be my guest. But don't expect me to come and save you.
You're warned now. But let's get to the next question then. If cryptocurrencies are then adopted by the general population and not just used as investments, or you would probably say speculation, how will that influence the role of central banks?
Again, the short answer, it won't. I think what is the missing link here is that to be an ordinary accepted means of payment, you should be accepted by everyone. I mean, that is basic, that is what notes and coins are about. That is a liability of the government, of the central bank, that is accepted as everyone to settle a payment. And I wonder if cryptocurrencies supported by no official government or not backed by gold or whatever is able to fulfill that function. I simply have my doubts.
And I guess your weapon in this case is to go out and just tell people, if you do it, you're on your own.
Yes,
right.
Basically.
Right, good. Now, there's a lot of people wanting to know whether you have a personal opinion. I don't know whether you in your job can have personal opinion.
No, we are not allowed to have personal opinions.
Well, then do you then have a professional opinion on whether the Danish krone should stay fixed to the euro?
Are you kidding? That's my mandate. I will do whatever it takes to keep the peg, because it's my mandate. It's as simple as that. So don't mess with me on the peg.
Now, when you look at those things you had up there, the slides, and you see how interest rates, they just go like this for a long time, years actually. There's a question here which is basically about whether you still have ammunition to do whatever it takes in a financial crisis. It says, with interest rates close to or even below zero in the US, in the EU as well as the US, what instruments will Western national banks have turned to maintain inflation? I guess that's your mandate as well, right?
Yeah, yes it is, and we have the way we are fulfilling our 1936 legislation on this point is to keep the peg and to connect the Danish kroner with an area where you have an inflation targeting. So far so good. But of course the puzzle globally, and it is a puzzle. I'm just returned from last month from a meeting in Washington, the annual meeting of IMF. And the great puzzle is, why is inflation so low globally? Why is it so low? Why is real rates, nominal interest rate minus the inflation, why are they globally so low? And there are no easy answer to that question. But given the mandates of the central banks, they still have to have a very supporting monetary policy to secure that we have this inflation regime in most cases, in most countries, near to or below 2%.
But you could also, I mean, when we talk about these low interest rates, how low can you go would be a good question. I mean, do you still have the ammunition? So, or is the gunpowder wet? I think we should get rid of these before you trip up here. But do central banks still have the weapons they need if we are in another situation, another financial crisis?
That's a good question, and I think basically the answer is yes. But of course, we have not so much in ammunition as if the starting point for the interest rates were 5% or 10% for that sake. And therefore, there's also a global discussion about should we change our interest rate or our inflation targeting. There have been ideas, for example, by Ben Bernanke saying that we should target the price level and not the long-term inflation rate instead of a short-term inflation rate. So there are a lot of ideas out there, but I think the main problem has been that there has been that some of the other policy areas has been left out. That for good or worse reasons, fiscal policy was not considered, at least by parliaments and governments around the world, to be the natural way of solving the crisis by simply creating more demand.
So they were not doing their job?
You could say they didn't make some of the structural changes that maybe would have prevented this situation, and they were not able or willing to, for example, to make unfinanced tax or lowering the tax rates or having higher public sector demand for a shorter period of time. Therefore, we end up with this being the only game in town. And so you could say that monetary policy has simply been overburdened in the last 10 years or so. And hopefully we will end up, we will enter a phase where we have much more balanced policies than we have seen over the last 5 to 10 years.
But I could ask it another way. This only game in town, if it is still the only game in town, have you got game?
Yes, I think we have our own special game, but that is due to the peg. You could say Denmark is in a much more comfortable situation than most other countries. We have in international comparison, we have a low public sector deficit, low public sector accumulated debt. And our balance of payment situation is also quite positive compared with a lot of other countries. So we have room for maneuver in Denmark, which is not the case in many other countries where, for example, the public sector accumulated debt is so high that if you have even higher public sector expenditures, you will maybe have higher interest rates, and thereby creating the dynamics that are quite bringing it out of control.
You quoted Mario Draghi. He's very quotable.
Yes.
For saying non-elected officials should deliver on their mandates. And you said a moment ago that many national governments were paralyzed, this is going back to the financial crisis, for political reasons or by fiscal constraints.
Yep.
Therefore, central banks were forced to take on a large responsibility and so on. Now, are we out of that situation? When you look at the political landscape, I mean, politics is a risk you will have to watch out for as well, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm looking outside of Denmark here,
of
just
course.
not, yeah.
Yes.
Makes it less controversial, right?
Well, I think it's obvious that, for example, in the euro area, the situation now is much better than it was 2 or 3 years ago. The growth rate has picked up. You have the debt dynamics also in some of the weaker countries are much less painful than it used to be, and so in that sense there are a lot of positive news out there. You can again the financial markets are quite good to catch up on this. If you look at the spreads between, for example, Spanish government bonds and German government bonds, it is very, very low compared with what it used to be on the top of the crisis. So a lot of good things has happened, and globally the very low interest rates has created a room for maneuver also for governments.
Right. Let's then take one of the questions going down this road here. What do you do to ensure the financial system when we see changes in the political systems with nationalism and possibly more divided EU?
I have to say that's outside my mandate. I don't do anything.
But let's look at this change that's going on politically.
Yep.
You have Brexit. That's a big trading partner for Denmark. We don't know where that's going to end up, as far as I can see.
Nope.
Is that a danger? Is that a risk?
Well, I think it's a risk for UK more than it is a risk for the rest of Europe. I came back Monday from a visit to London, and in fact I was inside the Parliament. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to find out what is the direction and what is the framework for Brexit. Is it going to be a hard Brexit or soft Brexit? Is it going to be an orderly hard Brexit or disorderly hard Brexit? We don't know. And I wonder if the Brits know themselves. So I think it creates a lot of difficulties also for financial institutions based in London. What are they going to do? What are they going to do with all their employees that are foreign citizens, for example? What's going to happen with the Irish border, Irish and Northern Ireland border? A lot of practicalities which has not been solved, and time is running out. That is the feeling you are left with visiting London.
But isn't it a lose-lose situation then?
It is a lose-lose situation, but some are more losers than others.
And that would be the Brits?
Yes.
Now then you have this sort of, what I call old-fashioned political anger. I guess the Brexit vote could be seen as part of it. This sort of, even an American president being very skeptical of open markets and globalizations and so on. Do you see a risk there?
Yes, certainly I do. I think a lot of our wealth in globally has been created by globalization, but it has also created what you would call losers. And I think Margrethe Vestager was in the opening session was explaining this very, very well. A lot of people are very fearful and a lot of people have the feeling that they have missed the train. Therefore, for example, in IMF, inside IMF and among the member states, there's this concept of inclusive growth. You have to secure that the gains of globalization, of free international trade, is more equally distributed inside the country. The paradox, if you look globally at this, is that the global inequality has massively declined, but the distribution of income inside a lot of countries is higher now than it used to be. And this is, of course, in a democracy creating a lot of tensions. If you look at the US and take a tour from Detroit and surroundings, you will find out what this is about. That people that has been used to have well-paid jobs, they are basically on the street and left with no hope. And of course they are angry. And they are not, their next job is not in Silicon Valley. So that is what basically maybe the election in the US.
Is that in a way a bigger danger, this sort of anger and what it has meant politically, than what you see happening in the financial system right now? The political side of it.
Well, now we are a little bit out of my comfort zone.
Okay. I like to take people out of their comfort zones. Well, you can draw your own conclusions here. Now, let's just come back to the cryptocurrency for a moment, because someone here is saying, you state that cryptocurrency does not have any value. How does the digital money we currently use have value? We don't use the gold standard anymore.
No, that's right. But we are using my standard. We have the goal to keep the value of the money stable. And we're doing this by connecting ourselves to the euro, where there is a mandate of having this below but close to 2% inflation target. And that is the way we are handling these issues. And if you look at, compare, it's a little bit unfair, but if you compare Bitcoins with your deposits in your local bank, these deposits are protected by an deposit insurance guarantee up to 750,000 Danish kroner. So basically, you are protected in any way possible that your deposit is secured. That is not the case for some of the other instruments. So what we used to say is that deposits in a bank have the same safety as a note with my name on. So that is basically the security in a deposit bank system like the Danes.
Is it nice to be allowed to put your name on?
No, it's very boring. I use half the day signing notes.
Well, then I think we should have this question. Do you think that in the long run, money will still exist?
Yes, I think it serves a very basic need as a way of transforming your wage, or whatever you will call it, into goods or services. And that basic functioning has to be done by someone. But I'm not saying that we have banks for the future. I mean, 10 years from now, I can imagine a situation where your bank is Starbucks. Why not? Already today, as far as I know, people are buying prepaid cards at Starbucks, using them for buying coffee or whatever they buy. And why not? And in that way, they are one of the biggest, have one of the biggest deposit bases in the US. That's interesting. And why not, if Amazon maybe becomes even more dominant, why couldn't your wages being paid out to an account with Amazon? So, but I have to say then, and of course we as regulators and overseeing financial stability, we will need to react one way or the other to that kind of development. I used to say, if it looks like an elephant and says like an elephant, it should be regulated as an elephant. And of course, we have to take that into account, that if some non-bank behaves like a bank, may be involved in some kind of maturity transformation, that is what banks used to do, then they should be regulated as a bank. Goes without saying.
Now, I know you have a plane to catch soon. Just a couple of questions. One of them will be from there, but you sound like a man who sleeps soundly every night. But what keeps you awake at night of all these problems, if anything?
The unknown unknowns.
That must be a nightmare. You can't even explain it in the morning, right? And then, for all these are the leaders of tomorrow. For the leaders of tomorrow present here today, what is the most important thing to learn when studying?
It is to learn to study. To have the ability to take up new knowledge. I mean, you are here for a few years. I'm a very old guy, and it is almost 40 years since I left university. And you have, what you learn today is some kind of capital. You have to renew it, you have to nurse it, but to nurse it, you have to be able to learn again. And therefore, the very bad news comes now. You have to have strong technical skills. I know that a lot of things you can do on the net. You can seek information and so on. But it's useful to have some technical skills in math, in statistical knowledge, basic statistic knowledge, and so on. Because that is a little bit hard to learn if you are 63 from basics. I have, out of experience, I can tell you. So pick it up now, use it later, and go on learning, because you can't plan your career. Stop with that. It doesn't make any sense. And be able to catch the moment. Carpe diem. Okay.
We'll leave you with that message then. Thank you.